So, good afternoon, evening, or morning to everyone and anyone who is listening to this. My name is Auritra Basu, and I'm from the University of Delhi. Today, I'll be reading a paper entitled Shakespeare and the Ethics of Psychoanalysis. So, I'll begin. Jacques Lacan, in his seminar entitled The Ethics of Psychoanalysis, enlists four paradoxes which are central to the Freudian understanding of psychoanalysis. He shows us how ethics is about a relationship between action and the desire that informs that action, by relating it to the tragic sense of life, which is about overcoming the Aristotelian understanding of pity and fear. In the last two sections of his seminar entitled The Essence of Tragedy and the Tragic Dimension of Analytical Experience, Antigone is analyzed from an analyst's perspective. The four paradoxes mentioned in this seminar and the tragedy complement each other perfectly in these sections, as Lacan attempts to take resort to classical literature to illustrate a psychoanalytic paradigm. These paradoxes can be understood only with the tool of the three orders of Lacanian psychoanalysis: the real, the symbolic, and the imaginary, which govern the Lacanian universe of psychoanalysis. However, the implication of these paradoxes are not limited to Antigone, which was the obvious choice of text for a discussion on ethics. As Lacan writes, and I quote, "Is there anyone who doesn't evoke Antigone wherever there is a question of law that causes conflict in us, even though it is acknowledged by a community to be just a law?" Unquote. Therefore, it is of paramount importance to extend the implications of these paradoxes beyond the obvious, and the four great tragedies by William Shakespeare provide a unique opportunity of understanding these paradoxes separately and together. Following the footsteps of Lacan, I argue that these texts have an internal schema which would fit the ambiguous and apparently self-contradicting nature of the paradoxes. It has often been argued that Shakespearean heroes have an ambiguous ethical standpoint, granting them access to the paraphernalia of experience and fictionality, which made Antigone the perfectly analyzable character in this context. The essence of a tragedy in the hubris, hamartia, and catastrophe gives the discourse of ethics in psychoanalysis a new dimension. The first paradox which Lacan mentions is that one can be guilty only of giving ground relative to one's desire. The paradox lies in the connotation, wherein giving ground to means both yielding and not fulfilling one's desire. The apparent relation it has with the tragic hero in terms of the manifestation of their hubris can be best illustrated with instances from none other than Macbeth. The desire to become the king was imparted in Macbeth by the other, manifested in the character of the witches and Lady Macbeth. Until the first act, Macbeth was guilty of not fulfilling his desire of becoming the king. His soliloquy at the end of Act 1 shows him tormented between the two possibilities of the paradox. And I quote, "He is here in double trust. First, I am his kinsman and his subject. I have no spur to prick the sides of my intent, but only vaulting ambition which overleaps itself and falls on the other." In the subsequent acts, he is guilty of yielding to his desire by killing Duncan, Banquo, Lady Macduff, and many others. He suffers from guilt from both his action and his thoughts. In a way, his superego punishes him for having thoughts which his moral standards do not approve. That is the reason why he, despite being a typical neurotic, hallucinates like a psychotic in the dagger scene and the banquet scene. The question in this context is whether the witches are a part of Macbeth's hallucination or not. The only problem in this context is that Banquo is also able to see and hear them. However, returning to the context of the guilt which inadvertently informs this paradox, the unconscious guilt of Macbeth builds up a false image of himself, an image which is supplanted by his hypothetical mirror stage. The mirror stage is a stage where the baby enters into the imaginary state and starts to separate itself from the image of the big other, which is the image of its parents. He identifies with his ideal ego in an unprecedented manner, and the unconscious guilt sets him up for the ultimate punishment, that of death. However, the most pertinent example of this paradox is found in the perfect neurotic Hamlet, who is constantly oscillating between the desire to do and the hindrance towards fulfilling that desire. In a way, Hamlet exhibits an amalgamation of the three prisoners from Lacan's essay, Logical Time and the Assertion of Anticipated Uncertainty, with the black and white discs on their back, who are characterized by an oscillation between hesitation and haste, thus corroborating to the ethical paradox of psychoanalysis under scrutiny. When Hamlet saw Claudius praying, it granted him a unique opportunity to avenge his father's murder, but he became guilty of not fulfilling his desire. It is important to note in this context that the desire of Hamlet, namely of possessing his mother by killing his father, is an act already completed, though in transgression, by Claudius. Therefore, Claudius is guilty of giving ground relative to desire in one context, whereas Hamlet is guilty of the same in a different context. This peaceful coexistence is what makes the play a suitable text for analysis in this context. The relationship of Claudius, Hamlet, and the paradox changes completely at the end, where finally Hamlet enters his time to conclude and kills Claudius. At the hands of a desire-driven Hamlet, Claudius has no agency, and he becomes guilty of not fulfilling his desire of possessing Gertrude. And Hamlet, on the contrary, becomes guilty of fulfilling his desire of possessing his mother by killing his father figure of Claudius, stirring his unconscious to display symptoms in the play within a play setup. Here I'm of course referring to Claudius. Hamlet's guilt of not fulfilling his desire for almost the entire length of the play similarly informs his choice of running a sword through a curtain, imagining Claudius to be behind it, and mourning extravagantly for Ophelia's death after having ignored her for most of her lived hours. The second paradox of Lacan is that the definition of a hero is someone who can be betrayed only with impunity. In Antigone, Ismene betrays Antigone by refusing the latter to bury her brother's body, but Antigone goes ahead with it nonetheless. The hero does not desert their desire under any circumstance, and their response to betrayal is indifference. Here is the pivot where King Lear and his daughters are largely similar, but significantly different as well. The betrayal of Goneril and Regan came because of Lear's own misunderstanding of his daughter's affections towards him. Therefore, the platform for betrayal was set by Lear himself, whereas in Antigone the platform was set by Creon and Antigone's brother. In addition, Antigone was completely alone, but Lear had the explicit support of the King of France and the court fool. However, the similarity lies in the fact that the hero can liberate their betrayer instead of punishing them. The fate of Creon and that of Goneril and Regan are similar, and the paradoxical nature lies in the twisted way in which the hero does something unnatural by liberating the betrayer instead of punishing them. The surprising twist comes in Othello, where towards the end of the play, Othello says about Desdemona, and I quote, "She must die, else she'll betray more men. Put out the light and then put out the light. If I quench thee, thou flaming minister, I can again thy former light restore, should I repent thee." Death, in this context, is scarily close to the notion of liberation. These plays, like Antigone, are full of Christian connotations. However, the death of characters like Lear, Othello, Iago, Goneril, Regan, Desdemona, and others do not carry the same connotations of liberation, as it is the purpose of the hero, and only the hero, that is Lear and Othello in this context, to liberate the others. Almost all of Shakespearean heroes have a foil, be it Banquo to Macbeth, Horatio to Hamlet, or others. The relationship of the hero and their foil is not one of exclusive camaraderie or animosity, as can be estimated from the instance stated. The opposing trait which J.A. Cudden defines as the function of the foil is the ability of the foil to be betrayed and without the use of impunity. It is often found in foils present in other seminal tragedies, like Jocasta in Oedipus Rex, where she is unaware of both Oedipus's identity and the curse, and commits a grave crime as a result. It is in contrast with the foil that the hero emerges as someone exclusive and unique in the context of these paradoxes. It can be further argued that the presence of foils, right from the time of Sophocles, informed the formation of these two paradoxes explored by Lacan, and that the paradoxes in turn have enhanced the presence and relevance of an almost obsolete trope, that of the foil in the 20th century and beyond. The works around this area have predominantly focused on elaborating the arguably dense work laid down by Lacan, be it his unique approach of reading Antigone as the Pandora's box of psychoanalytic ethics, or be it charting the graph of desire by using the character of Hamlet. In the book chapter entitled Tragedy and Psychoanalysis, Freud and Lacan, the author writes, I quote, "The work of Jacques Lacan is once again a major factor in the rise of structuralist approaches to psychoanalysis and tragedy. Like Levi-Strauss, Lacan is interested in the basic schemata that underlie various subjective configurations and confrontations. When Lacan turns to a reading of Antigone, he refers to Levi-Strauss's conversations with the play." Unquote. This structuralist reading sits perfectly with the issue at hand, since Levi-Strauss's structural study of a myth and the structural study of these plays are not so different. While Hamlet and his neurotic comrades ask, to be or not to be, Lacan's understanding of the ethics of psychoanalysis effectively tells us that it could be both, existence and the lack of it. The paradoxical nature of the paradigms set forth by Lacan makes them exist on both sides of the equation. However, the last two paradoxes offer some resistance if they are to be understood in the context of the Shakespearean tragedies. This is because all the paradoxes do not have the same configuration. The first two paradoxes fit more perfectly, probably because they are more universal to tragedies, whereas the last two are more specific to Antigone. The third paradox is, as Lacan writes, for the ordinary man, the betrayal that almost always occurs sends him back to the service of goods, but with the proviso that he will never again find that factor which restores a sense of direction to that service. Unquote. It is the third paradox that essentially differentiates between the hero and the common man. In Macbeth, the betrayal of Macbeth sent Fleance back to the service of the goods, but it took their family generations to fulfill the prophecy of the witches. However, in King Lear, Goneril and Regan were not sent back to the service of the goods. Instead, they betrayed Lear more and more in the later acts of the play. By exempting them from any punishment in the initial stages, when Lear had 100 knights and some semblance of power, Lear ensured his place as the hero of the play. Irrespective of the fact that in Hamlet, the eponymous protagonist was betrayed by his mother and uncle, and the former was not even punished for her deed, the position of Hamlet as the hero does not change. He forgives Claudius on countless occasions and takes the entire length of the play to do something as simple as executing an act of revenge. However, the other characters are led to the path of good, especially that of Gertrude. She is forgiven precisely to ensure that Hamlet's position as the hero of the play remains unscathed. The final paradox is that there is no good other than that which may serve to pay the price for access to desire. This paradox is inadvertently linked to catharsis, the literal payment which patients have to pay to sit for a session with an analyst, and the fact that we should not produce more than we can consume. The last paradox becomes all the more pertinent if we consider the four tragedies in connection to one another, insofar as the death of the main characters, which happens due to them accessing their desire and subsequently paying the price for it. It might be argued here that this is true for almost all tragedies, but just pertaining to one of the aspects of the four paradoxes explored by Lacan does not automatically grant them access to the gateway of being considered as an ideal text for analysis in this context. Shakespeare's contemporaries like the university wit Christopher Marlowe also wrote significant tragedies where the characters faced brutal and catastrophic deaths. In Edward II, the death of Edward II was due to him accessing his desire. Both younger Mortimer, Edward II, and Gaveston were betrayed by impunity, and in this play, there is no liberation offered by the hero. Thus, it comes as no surprise that such an analysis needs texts which have multiple points of entry and understanding, where a single paradox has both its possible kinds of manifestation. The differences between the four Shakespearean tragedies and most other plays outweigh the differences between Antigone and these four tragedies. With more similarities than differences with Antigone in the aspect of these paradoxes, these four tragedies give these paradoxes a wider understanding. Lacan, after stating that Antigone is the most apt choice for this analysis, says in the final section of his seminar, there is no reason to limit the exploration of this field simply to Antigone. unquote. Having set the ground for further expansion of the propositions or paradoxes, he gave examples from a few Greek plays. In the Aristotelian scheme of things, these paradoxes sit well insofar as their generic application is concerned. For instance, when J.A. Cudden defines hubris as the shortcoming or defect in the Greek tragic hero, which leads him to ignore the warnings of the gods and to transgress their laws or commands, and that eventually hubris leads to downfall and nemesis, it essentially implies a kind of giving ground relative to one's desire. Furthermore, the tragic flaw or hamartia is that which facilitates the betrayal of the hero by impunity, because the betrayal comes into existence as a corollary of that unique tragic flaw. In the Freytag's pyramid, the elements of catastrophe and denouement correspond to the last paradox, as the hero and most of the other characters pay the ultimate price for accessing their desires, the price of death. This is what brings about the essence of a tragedy, and though there might be subtle and minute differences in the manifestations of this generalization, it has a few applications in some seminal texts. Similarly, when Aristotle defines tragedy as, quote, an imitation of an act that is admirable, complete and possesses magnitude, in language made pleasurable, each of its species is separated in different parts, performed by actors, not through narration, effecting through pity and fear the purification of such emotions, unquote. In his Poetics, the interpretation could very well be of a form of art that pays the ultimate price for accessing its desire. The desire in this case is to arouse the emotions of pity and fear in the audience and then purge them through catharsis, which is precisely why this aspect is present in the fundamental definition of tragedy. The price it pays is the death of the fictional character who lived full lives within the narrative of the play, and in a broader sense, that of the death of the author, who loses all agency after the play is completed from their end. Though it might seem that this last bit is true for all possible art forms, as Roland Barthes had argued, it stands its ground for tragedy based on the fact that it requires a purification which is unique to this genre. Thank you. That is it from my end.
Thanks very much. Brilliant. Certainly a huge amount to be thinking about in that first paper. Excellent. Thanks so much. Brilliant. So next we have